kind of run through of this lava material I've been working on. It has some interesting custom functions in it. So just going to talk about this a bit. Um, so to start off with, you're going to need two material functions. You're going to need this one. All right. So you can call this one normal from grayscale or normal from height map. This is basically going to take a grayscale output here, or an input. So you create a material function. You can do that uh, in your browser. You can just say, let's see, no, not new folder. There you go. If you just type material function, you make one of these, call it normal from grayscale or normal from height map. You're going to create two function inputs for this one. Your first one's going to be a vector 3. You can call it grayscale. Your second one is going to be called input strength of radius. Next up, you can set default values here. You're always going to need an input here, so I don't set this one to use the preview as default. But over here, you could set it to use preview as default. And basically, this is going to be a scale of the object radius. I'm realizing now that I actually need we're going to make an alteration to this right now. And we're going to call this a scalar value, and we're just going to call this radius. And we're going to plug the object radius into this. And then we're going to plug this into this. And the reason I do that is because on my planet, I can't use this. I need to use like the actual planet's radius, so we'll need to provide a different value. But we can make it use the radius by default. All right, there we go. So let's finish up the function here. So we've got input radius, connect the object radius node to it. Input grayscale, leave this unconnected and unchecked. So vector 3. Input strength is connected to a constant with a value of 0.02 as the default, and you can check use preview value as default. So we're going to take the radius and we're going to multiply it with the input strength, and then we're going to multiply that by the grayscale value, and then you're going to find this prepare perturb normal HQ node, and you're going to hook that value in here. And then there's another node called preturb normal HQ node, and you're just going to hook 1 to 1, 1 to 1, 1 to 1. These three nodes into these three nodes, and then you're going to output that. And this is the node that generates our normal map. All right. So that's one of the two material functions we need for the material. The next one is this, and I will, when I put this on YouTube, I'll link the GitHub, but just so that people can see the code and be able to copy it, I will zoom in on it. So we got more inputs on this one, obviously. So you're going to want a vector 3 input here, and we can look at the settings. Vector 3 input, use preview value as default, absolute world position, and make sure you select excluding material shader offsets. Object radius, input, or just radius, connect the object radius to this. All of these have use preview value as default checked. Input frequency is a scalar. Okay, so this one's a vector 3. The rest of these are scalars except for one at the bottom, and we'll talk about that. So object radius, input frequency, set a default value with a constant of 1. Input edge min, set a default value with a constant of 0. Input edge max, set a default value with a constant of 0.05. Input edge rounding, set a default value with a constant of 0.1. Input octaves, set a default value with a value of 1. Input octave frequency scale, set a default value of 2 constant, and input octave amplitude scale, set a default value of 0.5 into here. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And then you're going to want to add a custom node. All right. And to that node, you're going to want to add these inputs and make sure they're named exactly the same as they're named here. So world position, radius, frequency, edge rounding, edge min, edge max, octaves, octave frequency scale, octave amplitude scale. All the capitalization has to be exactly the same. So these have to be exactly the same, and you add them here. This is a custom node. You type in custom, and you do that, and you get a custom node. And you can go and add inputs like this, and you go in and you set the names exactly equal to these, right? Next up, I'm not going to review the code, but I will zoom in on it and scroll down it so that you can pause and kind of take in the code. So this is a shader that I found on ShaderToy and converted. It was initially a 2D Voronoi function. So I spent a lot of time trying to use the Voronoi noise that comes with Unreal to generate this type of pattern of edges. You simply can't do it. With the way that they're outputting their Voronoi noise, you cannot isolate the edges effectively. So we wrote our own, or we didn't write our own. We went to ShaderToy, found somebody who had done Voronoi with edge masking, copied it, converted it from GLSL to HLSL, converted it from 2-dimensional to 3-dimensional, and then added fractal Brownian motion to it. So that means the one on ShaderToy was a 2D, this is a 3D, and the one on ShaderToy was not a fractal, and this is a fractal. And that's why we have our octave fields and such. So you would want the code to be exactly as it is here. I'm not going to go over the code line by line because I'm going to link the GitHub eventually for this. But if you want to do it just by typing it in, you can see what's on the screen here. You can pause it, write down whatever. I'll scroll down a bit. You can pause it here. I'll wait a few seconds. Enter in the rest of the code. Once you've closed the struct right here with the semicolon and the last curly brace that closes this Voronoi function struct, you come down here, and this is the last little bit. You declare a Voronoi function struct. You set up your default values like so. Again, make sure that you name your input values correctly or these will not work, at least not the way that they're written here. And then finally, we return VF, which is our instance of Voronoi functions, edge Voronoi FBM with our scaled position. All right. The output of this, we feed into the material function output node, and that is our entire Voronoi function. Now this is crucial to be able to do the shader effect, all right? So you got to have this function and this function. Once you got those two, the rest of the shader is not that difficult. So let's go and see what we're doing over here, right? So, we're actually going to go ahead and add a block around this, distortion. All right, so what are we doing? So this first block here that you want to construct is the distortion of the noise. I'm distorting it with a texture sample of a volume noise. If you have volume noises you can use in your library, like this I think was a $5 plugin that I bought a long time ago. I've got a lot of mileage out of. you can use these. If you don't have volume noise, um, you can actually sub out this texture sample node for just a noise node, right? And it won't be exactly the same because it's going to be a different texture, but it will give you distortion using a noise. So like you can literally like replace this in the texture object over here with a noise node if you don't have volume noises that you can use. That said, it makes the shader more expensive when you do that. The reason I'm using the volume noise is because it saves computations, because these noise functions are expensive. Sampling a 3D texture is less expensive. All right, so let's look at what we're doing here. So we're taking our world position and we're dividing it by our object radius to get a normalized scale of our world position. And then we're multiplying that by a scalar parameter, distortion scale. We have a default value set at 2 here. We're multiplying that by our, let's move this up so that it doesn't interfere. We take our world position, we divide it by our object radius, we multiply it by our distortion scale. That forms our, basically our UV to sample our texture or noise function from. So here I have a volume texture selected and plugged into the texture node of this texture sample, and then I'm plugging in the distortion scale multiplied by this scaled world position into the UV of the texture sample. I'm taking the output of that, multiplying it by the object radius, then I'm multiplying that by this scalar parameter that you'll have to create distortion intensity. Finally, we're taking the output of all those operations and our original world position here, and we're adding them together, and then we're plugging that into, you'll have to create a material function call, look up edge Voronoi. We're taking the output of this addition of this noise calculation here and the original world position, and we're plugging that into the world position of our node. So we do that, and I'll show you why. So let's turn off the distortion. So this is what it looks like with no distortion. This is what it looks like with too much distortion. Here's what it looks like with a lot, but like you still might want this. It basically allows us to apply progressive distortion to our noise. We can change the scale, etc., etc. So I think I had it on 0.05 by default. But yeah, you can mess with these values once you get it all rigged up and see what happens. All right. The next field you need to plug into your edge Voronoi function is the object radius, which is just the object radius, unless you're saying doing multiple different meshes composing a larger object, which I do, in which case you would plug in like the total radius of the composite object. But just for simple use case, you just plug the object radius in here. Next up, we've got frequency. I have this set to 0.5 here. I'll show you what happens when we change that. It increases the frequency of the noise or decreases it, right? So I have 0.5 set by default, so I create a scalar value, set it to 0.5, name it frequency, and plug it into the frequency field of our Voronoi function. All right, next, edge min and edge max. So this is like the floor of your edges. So this is like how quickly does your edge go from it's fading into the edge to it's fully faded in. So I usually have this set by default at 0. That gives you a nice like gradient fade in to your edge. And then you have your edge max. This is determining the thickness. This, along with edge rounding together, are determining the thickness of the cracks in the material. So if I set this to 2, we get thicker cracks. If I set it to 3, even thicker. 4, 5, 6. At 1, we're just complete lava. 0.5, mostly lava. 0.1, cracks. 0.05, smaller cracks. You get the idea. So we'll set that at 0.1. Edge rounding is similar, but this rounds the cells of the Voronoi output, and that might be easier to see if we set only one octave. So if we set this to 0 and we set our distortion to 0, you can see this is the cracked cell pattern that's coming out of our Voronoi function, right? If I set this to 0.1, you can see that the cracks start to get rounder. 2, 5, now they're very round, but it also causes them to grow. So you kind of want to stay in probably the lower ranges with this. But you can also kind of pair this with reducing the edge max function to get rounder edges while still having kind of thin cracks, right? So we're going to go back to our default here, 0.1, 0.1, and we're also, okay. So edge min and max plug into edge min and max. Edge rounding plugs into edge rounding. And that's going to be the same for all these. They're just plugging into their corresponding named thing. Octaves, so we've added a fractal function to this. So if we want to run multiple octaves of noise, we can. So running 2 octaves, 3 octaves, 4 octaves, 5 octaves, 6 octaves. I would suggest not going much higher than that because it gets progressively more expensive to render this function the more times you're iterating here. But 6 seems to be pretty reasonable as far as the texturing goes. And we'll also bring our distortion back. Okay, next up, octave frequency scale. So this is how much smaller does the noise get each time an octave happens. So with it set to 3 like I have here by default, each progressive layer of noise is 3 times smaller than the other one. So like if I set this to 2, each layer is 2 times smaller. If I set this to 1, it's just a bunch of layers of the same scaled noise on top of each other. If I set this to 4, 6, it changes the rate at which it scales down into smaller and smaller cracks, right? So I think 3 looks pretty good, and that's what I've been using. So you can set it to 3. Finally, we've got octave amplitude scale. This value is the effectiveness of each subsequent level. So if level 1 is 100%, level 2 would be 50% at 0.5, level 3 would be 25%, level 4 would be 12.5%. Every time we go down a level, whatever your amplitude scale is, you're multiplying that by that. So if I go to 0.75, the lower levels have more of an effect than they did before. If I go to 1, all the levels will always have the same amount of effect. So now you're just overlaying every single level at the same basic effectiveness, right? So we'll go back to 0.5. Generally speaking, 0.5 is pretty good. All right, so once you've created all these values and your distortion segment, whether or not you're using the noise or a texture sample to do it, and you've hooked them into the Voronoi function that we looked at earlier, you're going to take the result here and break it out into float 4 components. So let's look at what those are. Component mask. Okay, here's the whole function. So let's look at each layer individually, right? This layer is basically a mask of the non-cracked areas. This layer is a mask of the cracks. This layer is a distance to the edge function, which basically becomes our height map function, right? Once all of our octaves have been processed and their distortion has been processed, this becomes a height map function. And this is the inverse of that height map function, which can be useful sometimes, but we're not using it here. So what we're concerned with for this material are the cracks and the height map. So that means we're going to be using green and blue channels out of our output from that edge Voronoi function. All right, so next up, we've got, first off, this is our color blending function. We're taking our edge distance, so B, and we're plugging that into a power function with a rock peak fall off scalar value here. Currently have this set to 2, 1.5. This controls the fade between the rock edge and rock peak colors. So if I put this at 1, we get almost all peak color. If I put this at 2, we get almost all edge color. If I put this at 1.5, we have like a kind of healthy blend between the two, right? You can kind of pick what colors you want to use. So like for instance, if I change this to a red or a blue or a green, you get different effects. I kind of like the way it looked over here. So I'm just going to leave it at that for now. So you're going to want a vector parameter, which is how you do a color. I've got one called rock peak here. I've got one called rock edge here. And I've got one called lava unlit here. So plug your rock edge into a lerp node, into the A, your rock peak into the B, take the output from your distance mask raised to your rock peak power and put that into the alpha, and then plug that into another lerp node into the A, plug your lava unlit into the B, and then take the alpha and plug it into your G, which this is your edge mask, right? So this is like your dark lava color. If we zoom in, you'll see that like here, but not over here. And we're going to talk about the glowing section in a second. All right, finally, take the output of this and plug it into your base color for your material. Let's take a look at the material too. For surface, opaque, default lit, that's it. Bog standard. Create a scalar parameter for specularity. I have it set to 0.5 right now. Plug it into specular. Easy. Just a straight value that you can change. All right, next, glow. We have a glow color. This changes the color of the glowing parts of the lava. So if I change this around, the part that's actually glowing changes colors, right? And so like a good orangey red, fully saturated, fully bright, tends to do well here. All right, so create a vector parameter, lava glow. Create two scalar parameters, glow fall off, glow intensity. Glow fall off I have set at 0.5, but I have it multiplied by 16. This is because you want a pretty good amount of fall off here in order to have a distinction between the darker and lighter parts of the lava. If I put this at 0 or like 0.1, then you don't get a lot of variance, but it can be useful to do that as well. But you can kind of see what effect this is having as we increase this number, right? The darker parts of the lava become more prevalent when we increase this. When we decrease it, the brighter parts become more prevalent until at 0.1, 0.01. You probably wouldn't want to go 0.01 because obviously it doesn't look very good, but at like 0.1, mostly it's the bright parts. All right, so next up, we create a power node. The output from this glow fall off multiply 16 goes in the exponent here. We plug in our crack mask, so our green channel, into the base of the power. We plug that into a multiply node with our color here. And then finally we multiply that again by this glow intensity value, and this is how bright is your glow. So if I increase this to 1000, the glow is too bright. If I put this at 1, it's not glowing at all. If I put this at 0, there's no glow, no luminance at all. We're just getting the base color. So at 1, we glow a little bit. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I have it set to 8 by default. So glow fall off, multiply, raise the crack mask to the power, multiply that by your lava glow color, multiply that again by your glow intensity, which I have set to 8. Take the output of this node, plug it into emissive color. Okay, next up, roughness. I've got this surface roughness factor. I have it set to 0.5 right now. The height map portion of this, so this is the distance mask, which is in the B channel, is going to get multiplied by the surface roughness factor. We're also doing a 1 minus here, and then we're adding them back together. So this is how shiny the rock portion can get. So like if I do this as a 1, it's as shiny as it can get on the rougher areas of like the raised areas of the feature, right? But this is too shiny. So if I do like a 0.8 or like a 0.5, like we had it on, now you get some specularity on the rocky parts. You won't get it on the lava parts. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So once you've done these, once you've done 1 minus this, you've multiplied this by the distance mask, you've added them back together, you just plug that straight into roughness. All right, we're almost done. Next part. So normal from a world position, or normal from our, I'll show you. And really, this should probably have a scalar value here. This is normal noise, surface noise contribution. Okay, let's set this to 1. Let's zoom out a bit. 0.1. So in addition to our noise that we're getting out of our distance function, we have another layer of noise here. So again, I'm using a volume texture for this, but just like in the other one, you can sub out a noise node for this if you want, and you can pick whatever type of noise you want. So I've got absolute world position divided by the object radius. This is to normalize our scale of our noise. Then I've got that multiplied by 10 so that we get a nice high frequency noise going on. And if we plug this in here and we plug this in here, it's not exactly the same, but you still get a similar variance pattern, but it does make it more expensive again, which is why I'm using volume textures for this stuff. But if you don't have these, you can use a noise texture and it'll work just fine. All right, so absolute world position divided by object radius multiplied by 10. I'm using a Voronoi volume texture here. Plug this value into the UVs of your texture sample or your noise node. Take the RGB output of that, subtract 0.5 from it, multiply it by a scalar parameter called surface noise contribution. This is how much of that noise that we're adding is going to take precedence over the height map stuff coming out of the Voronoi function. So like if I do this 1, it's like even. Like this has as much priority in determining the shape of the planet or the shape of the rocky parts as the height map does. But that doesn't look good, as you can see, because it tiles and such. But if we set it to like 0.5, it still doesn't look good. 0.1, it starts looking good. And that's because we're just using this to add some like microvariance to the normal itself. but we want most of the normal to come from the output of the Voronoi. So we'll set this to like 0.05 or zero point 0.2 or 0.1. 0.1 should be fine as a default. So we take the output of our noise node or our texture sample, we subtract 0.5 from it, we multiply it by surface noise contribution, and then we add that value with our distance mask coming out of the B channel from our Voronoi function. And then we have the normal from grayscale function that I talked about. We're going to take that function. So you're going to add a MF normal from grayscale. Add one of these. Plug in normal intensity. I have it set as by default to 0.005. If I have 0, there's no normals at all. 0.01, you get slight normals, 0.02, 0.03, 0.04, 0.05. So I have it set to 0.5 by default. You can play around with these numbers and get whatever you want. You're taking the output of this noise calculation that we did, you're adding it to the distance map, and then you're plugging that into the grayscale value of this normal from grayscale node. And then if you need a custom radius, you would plug that in, but we're not using that for this demo material, basically. Finally, you take the result of this, and if we start previewing this node, we will see that it is indeed a normal map. You take the results of this node, you plug it into the normal of your material. And now we're almost done. I only have one piece left. So displacement is the final thing that we do. So down here, take your object radius, multiply it by a scalar parameter called displacement amount. I have this set baseline to 0.1. You can play around with this and see what it does. Take the output of that and multiply it by your distance map, so the B value again, from your Voronoi function, and then take the output of that and multiply it by a vertex normal world space node. Finally, when all that's done, take the output of this, plug it into world position offset. And what this does is it causes the mesh to actually deform along with the kind of raised areas of the features. So like the areas that are rocky will be raised up, whereas the lava will be low lying. I don't want it to be that distinct. We could also select like a higher resolution mesh. So like here, I'll just select this. So with a higher resolution mesh, that's too much. But you can see what I'm talking about. Like it's displacing the mesh. This is not a good mesh to use for displacement, but I just wanted to demo what I was talking about. So like 0.1 again, and you get kind of like the geometry being affected by the material, right? Alright, so we had this set to 0.1. This mesh is super high resolution, so it's slowing everything down. We'll use our nice lower resolution mesh here. Alright, and then again, that plugs into world position offset. And when you're done with all that, it should look somewhat like this. You need this function, this function, this function. Real quick, I'll scroll this code again, so feel free to pause it at any point to copy code if you need it. And then finally, over here, we can actually show what everything is doing. Alright, so displacement amount. You can pretty easily see what's going on here when I mess with this. We'll reset it. Distortion. That's too much. Okay, there we go. Distortion intensity. This is what is kind of making it look more organic. if we have no distortion and a low number of octaves, it's going to not look super organic, right? Because we're just like we only have the Voronoi noise here, and somewhat ironically, if you were going to go with no distortion at all, it actually looks better with just one octave. But with a number of octaves, you're going to want at least a little bit of distortion because that's what's making everything look organic, right? Distortion scale. This is the frequency of the noise that's being used to create the distortion. So you can go smaller or bigger. So like bigger number here is smaller, higher frequency, right? I should have said distortion frequency. If you want to rename your input in the material to distortion frequency, that's fine. Edge min and max, this determines the width of your edge, with this being the floor, and this being the ceiling. If you want smaller cracks, you reduce this number, you get smaller cracks. We reduce it further, we get very small cracks. But remember, edge rounding has an impact on this as well. So like 0.01, 0.01. At a certain point, you're not going to be able to get smaller cracks without changing edge rounding. But as soon as we reduce the edge rounding, you'll see that we do indeed get smaller cracks. 0.01, 0.01. And generally speaking, you want these numbers to be like in the ballpark of each other. So like 0.1 and 0.1 looks pretty good. 0.05, 0.05, etc. So you can kind of play with these numbers and get a feel for what they do. I like the 0.1 and 0.1 as defaults. Frequency, this is the scale of this is like the master scale of the noise function. So as I increase frequency, we get a higher number of divisions and such. As I decrease it, it gets bigger. Set it to 0.5 by default, but 1 doesn't look bad either. Just depends on what you want to do with it. Glow fall off. This changes how much the lava part glows. Should be pretty apparent. Have it set to 0.5 by default. But if you wanted like 0.25, you got more glow. 0.1, everything's really glowing now. I like 0.5. I think it looks pretty good. Glow intensity, this is how bright is the light being given off by the glowing part. Negative isn't going to do anything. So, you probably don't want to go too high with this, but you don't want to go too low either. I mean, you might want to go, like, maybe you want it to be a cooling, right? If you wanted to show the lava cooling down, you could go from like 32 and like 1.5, and you could animate ramping down glow fall off and ramping down glow intensity at the same time and get like a fade out, right? You can just kind of see it. I like 8 as a default. I think it looks okay. Normal intensity, this is how much effect the normals are having. This is based on the radius. So you could think of this as like my normals will shade as if they were displacing the terrain by 33% of the radius with this number. So generally speaking, you're not going to have a normal displace more than like 0.05. Like 0.03 to 0.05 are kind of like sweet spot range. Octave amplitude scale, this is how much each subsequent octave contributes to the overall pattern. So at 0.75, like if I go higher, now the lower octaves are contributing more than the original higher octave, and that's why everything is broken up and very small, because our lowest octaves, the ones that are the smallest, now have the most effect. But if I go back down to like a 1 or close to 1, every octave has an equal effect on the combined noise. And if I go back down to a 0, we might as well not have octaves because this is what it would look like with no octaves. So this is like how much are the subsequent layers going to affect your fractal pattern. So normally 0.5, 0.75 are pretty good guesses for that. Octave frequency scale. This is uh, this is how much does the frequency increase for every octave. So here we have 1.5. You can see it getting much, much, much finer as I increase that, right? And that's because we're uh, the subsequent octaves have a high effect, and we're scaling by 3 times as much every time, or 2 times as much, or 1, which is now just overlapping noise that is not scaled, just offset. So 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Um, you you should probably get the idea. And you may also, as you get smaller, have to mess with the normal intensity, as you can see here. But generally speaking, we want our octave frequency scale to be in the like 1.5 to 3 range. 1.5 looks like this. 2 looks like this. I think 2 looks pretty good. All right, next up, rock peak fall off. So as described, this is our blend between the rock edge and peak colors. So as I decrease this, the peak color takes over. As I increase this, the edge color takes over. I have it set to like a 1.5 or a 2 by default. So we'll do 2 for this. Specularity, this is the overall specularity of the material, of the like entire material. Um, how specular it is, generally like a 0.5, 0.25, depends on the effect you're going for. Surface roughness factor. Okay, this is how much does our surface noise impact our normal map from our actual Voronoi noise function. So as I increase this, the surface noise has more effect. As I decrease this, it has less effect. If I put this on 0, it should have no effect, and now all of our normal map is coming from our Voronoi noise only. But if we zoom in on this, we can kind of see why we want this, right? Because like this doesn't look super great. But if I was to add a little bit more of this, it can kind of bring some variance into it. 0.25, 0.33. We'll set it to 0.33 for now. Next up, we have our distortion noise and our surface noise volume textures. So I'm using gradient here and a Voronoi here. You can kind of, if you have these, you could experiment with different volume textures, like do value turbulence. I could do Pearl and Worley. It doesn't matter too much for this one. The other one is the big one. So we'll send this back to Voronoi. Now this is the one that affects the distortion that's being applied. So right now we're using this gradient, but if I use curl noise, all of a sudden it's a lot more intense because this noise goes from -1 to 1. So it's not really in the same scale of what we were doing. Oops, that's not the one I wanted. Distortion intensity. But yeah, you can kind of see what I'm talking about. Um, if we do cell noise, it's gonna be interesting because this is a cubic distortion. So I don't know why you would want this, but you can kind of see what's going on a little bit when we use it. Let's see. Gradient is what I was on. Gradient turbulence. Perlin 3D. Perlin curl. Bigger Perlin curl. Perlin Worley balanced. Value. Value turbulence. And Voronoi. Voronoi, I would not suggest using in the distortion because it creates these very like signature. Um, unless you're going for that, it creates like these signature little like circles. I've been using gradient, which would be the equivalent of like Perlin noise. So go back up here, pick our gradient texture back up. There we go. These are the colors. If you want to do crazy like nuclear lava, you can mess around with the color scheme and do interesting things with it. Now it's like irradiated lava. But yeah, so we'll send these back to defaults. Um, there we go. Uh, and I think that about covers it. If you want to see what it looks like in a scene, it looks like this. Obviously, I don't have a ton of geometry on this sphere, so like it could look better with a higher density mesh here. And when I use this on my planet, uh, it'll have adaptive like tessellation, so you won't have to worry about it not having enough geometry basically to do its displacement. There you go. And let's see. Again, we can do if you want to have more lava, you can mess with this. If you want to have more lava, you can also mess with this, which is probably the better way to do it. A more natural way is to actually change the edge rounding because it gets this nice effect of like heating up almost. Like, oh, it's cool. Oh, we're heating up. Cracks are showing, and it's full lava, you know? Pretty neat. And so, yeah. Um, so I do have this stuff posted up on my GitHub. It's this guy here. You can see it right here. I'll also post a link when I post this video on YouTube to this. If we go in here, you can see it's the exact thing that I have pasted into the custom node. And so, yeah, that's it.